In the early 1970s, police in Lawton, Oklahoma would receive a series of chilling phone calls from terrified residents of something stalking their town. What I'll share with you in today's video that police reported on will make you think twice about ever setting foot in this Oklahoma town. In the late winter of 1971, a Donald child reportedly saw something that would chill him to the bone. Donald was a resident of Lawton, Oklahoma, a relatively calm and peaceful town. But he had no idea that he would come face to face with the stuff of nightmares and Hollywood horror movies. One evening, as he was sitting at home, he spotted something to the very front window of his house. He described it to the police as a monstrous creature and actually went into cardiac arrest on the spot. By most, he was considered a young man. He was only a little older than me, in his mid-30s. Now, it was later reported by the authorities that whatever this animal was had attempted to drink out of this small fish pond. However, the pond was empty and it soon left disinterested. Fortunately for Donald, he survived but was kept in the hospital in a continuous state of terror after what he saw. But folks, the story gets hairier. The media soon had a frenzy about this, and everything referred to this creature as a werewolf, judging by his descriptions. He was interviewed by a police officer named Clancy Williams. Donald described the creature very strangely. Get this, he claimed it was tall with lots of hair all over its face and dressed in a very indescribable manner, to quote him verbatim. He would later explain that it was apparently wearing pants that were far too small for it. This, however, was not an isolated incident. Other eyewitnesses of the same evening came forward and they claimed they saw the same creature bounding the streets and attempting to dodge vehicles. The most terrifying aspect is that it would switch between 4 legs and 2. Boom! Not even 30 minutes after Donald's initial encounter, a police officer named Harry Azell had to calm down one hysterical eyewitness. Now, Officer Azell claimed that an eyewitness had opened the window curtain at roughly 11:15 p.m., and this was when the eyewitness speculated that some sort of practical joke was being played on them because there was a sizable wolf-like creature perched on the railing. However, the eyewitness described it as more of a monkey or ape. Thinking it was a prop or a joke, it turned its head and looked right at the eyewitness, followed by jumping down to the ground, which was around 17 feet. Now, the eyewitness described its face as being horribly distorted, misfigured, akin to being in a fire, and hair all over its face, upper body, and the lower parts of its body. Next, ladies and gentlemen, we find out that the military actually got involved. Now, apparently, a group of soldiers from Fort Still had encountered this same creature roughly 15 minutes later. These were trained soldiers, and even they were terrified. The sightings occurred roughly on Friday and Saturday night. Now, what's crazy is that even though the Sunday following was relatively quiet, the police quickly acted. On that Monday, not even a total of 48 hours after the sightings, a Major Clarence Hill, the current commander of the Police Patrol Division at the time, sent out a widespread alert carefully ordering all of his men to be on watch for, and I quote, the Wolfman. Clearly, there had been enough eyewitness accounts that were not thoroughly documented that caused such a stir in this town. Strangely, the descriptions are not entirely what people would call a dogman. Some just believe this to be a mistaken Bigfoot sighting. However, an overwhelming amount of eyewitness descriptions point to a large bipedal wolf. The strangest part, of course, was apparently the pants on this creature that Donald saw, which would make us think that it was a shapeshifter of some kind. Understandably, anyone remotely skeptical would listen to this and think of something of a werewolf and just how absurd it all is. But make no mistake about it, folks, Oklahoma is home to many other dogman eyewitness accounts. Back about 20 years ago, when I was visiting Kentucky, because that's where my dad used to live, I saw something that most people don't believe exists. I call it a werewolf. I've heard other names for it, but I really don't know what else to name it. Back in 2001, I was trying to find my dad's house for the first time since he moved there, and I was using a map to try and find what road to take. I can't remember what 2-lane highway I was using, but I remember turning off into a pullout to put my car in park and study the map. As I'm looking down at the map, trying to find the right road to take, I get this overwhelming sensation that somebody's looking at me. I look up and look to my left onto the road, and there's nobody. No cars, nothing. Then I look to my right, and standing not even 10 feet away from my vehicle is a living werewolf in the flash, or at least that's how I would describe it. This thing had to be 9 to 10 feet tall easily, and was more solid than somebody who bench presses 200 pounds. This thing was a behemoth, with a head that resembled somewhat of a Doberman pinscher with sharp pointed ears and a wider, shorter snout. This thing was covered in jet black hair, but was not long and shaggy. It was more short and coarse because I could vividly remember seeing the muscle ripples through its fur. It was glaring at me, looking right into my eyes menacingly. It seemed pissed off that I pulled into that pullout and saw it. I don't know if I encroached on its territory or what I did, but I got the strong feeling that it did not want me around. I'm staring at this animal in total shock. It's like I was in some sort of trance looking into its evil yellow eyes. After what felt like 10 seconds, I was able to snap out of it, and I put that car into drive, and I whipped out of there so fast. I was probably doing 65 to 70 miles per hour when that highway is only about 45. In fact, a man by the name of David had actually encountered another man at a local fair who had reluctantly shared one of the most disturbing and strangest incidents from this gentleman's past. David refers to this man as Clark to disguise his real name. Now, this individual who he began speaking to is actually a notable public figure in that particular community and only ever agreed to share the story if his name would be changed. Now, years back to what David believes to be the 1980s, Clark was hunting deer near the woods of his home. He enjoyed hunting like many other folks who live in rural communities and really enjoyed that lifestyle. Since he had already established a deer stand, the evening quickly set in and the sun was setting in the sky. Clark's plan was simple: wait patiently in the deer stand until the first sign of a potential kill. Now, this was near Dierks Road towards the deep woods. The location of this deer stand is roughly a mile away from his property. As he's sitting up in his stand, he begins to hear something, rustling of some kind, something very large that he thought would be a very large buck. However, he noticed that whatever this was not trying to be quiet and was audibly very large, judging by how quick and noisy it was. Now, this figure, he describes, leapt out from a tree right down into a clearing in front of the stand. Remembering that this clearing is directly in front of the stand and is roughly about 50 by 80 feet, give or take, a rather small meadow. Clark was in complete fear because standing not even 50 feet away from him was a massive animal, something he would describe as an amalgamation of man and wolf. He claimed that this was towering and massive and easily 8 feet tall, if not larger. He described it as similar to a grizzly bear in size and stature. Its head, shoulders, and chest were incredibly massive, and it was pitch black in color. He then went on to describe the ears, that they were long and sharp, and rippling muscles could be seen underneath its unkempt fur. The hands he described were very much like that of a human's, 5 digits with long 3 to 4 inch black claws at the end of each. Its legs also had hocks, just like a dog. Now, this thing stood there for a few seconds before it began moving and froze mid-stride. And that's when it slowly tilted its head and turned towards his direction and began to sniff. It was here that Clark described urinating on himself out of complete terror. What he described next was nothing short of scary. He swears by this, and keep in mind the entire time he's keeping an eye on this thing through this little peephole in the stand, and he claims that this thing smirked at him and believes that it smelt him. It then turned its head back in the original direction it was planning on going, leapt up into another tree, and it was gone. Fearing that his life was now in danger, Clark decided to wait about 15-20 minutes, give or take, before very slowly and quietly exiting the tree stand, to which his gut instincts were screaming at him to leave. He describes that the entire woodlands around him were so quiet, you could hear his heart beating from a mile away. It was extremely unnerving. Now, unfortunately, this thing went in the same direction he had to take back to go to his own property, which was roughly a mile or so away. So what does Clark do? He starts going back in the direction of where he lived and made haste as best as he could. I mean, what is the guy supposed to do? Wait it out? Now, he wasn't even out of this tiny meadow for more than a couple of moments before he begins hearing sounds similar to what he had heard when he was up in the tree stand. Unfortunately, this time it wasn't just one large animal, several. Now, he would stop multiple times and just try to gauge his surroundings, thinking he was about to be flanked. What was even worse is that, judging from where the noise was coming from, he was being followed and surrounded by multiples of these things. They could not have been more than 20 to 30 feet away from him, given by the noise and how close they were. And what scared Clark greatly was that this was in November. So most of all the thick foliage and plants from everything was in the process of falling to the ground or had already depleted from the plants. Now, this meant that visibility should have allowed him to see what his potential assailants were, but he couldn't see anything. But he could certainly hear them. He almost described it as if they were somehow cloaked, because they were completely invisible to the human eye. Now, he just keeps going, and about at the halfway point where his stand was, in the back portion of where you would go onto Clark's property, was a small river. Now, this river actually runs parallel with the path, and it was right here where Clark described that a deer was tossed onto the path. A literal half-eaten deer, and I don't mean a deer that had been eaten on. I'm talking literally half the deer from about the chest up, including its front legs, where that was all that was left of it. He described it as if it had been torn apart and ripped in half, not eaten on and thrown there, but torn in half, and that there was just so much blood and carnage, and it looked gnarly. At this point, Clark is very much fearing for his safety. He was not going to stand there and take time to observe the remains of this deer, and it spooked him because he realized whatever these creatures were, they were now toying with him. He had not been out of his stand for more than 2 hours at most, and that deer was not there on the path before. It was conveniently placed right in the middle of his path, and he had no choice but to actually step around it to keep going. Now, he also mentioned something that I find very interesting. He would tell David that he kept getting these nasty whiffs of what he would describe as wet dog, urine, and rotting meat. It was a smell that would just come and go, but he described it as very heavy and pungent. You know how when it's summertime and it's really hot out, and if there's an odor, you can smell it really strong? Well, he described the odor as having that same intensity despite the cold weather. Now, once he made it back safely, he completely abandoned ever going back to that particular deer stand he had set up years ago, and, well, he's never been back since, according to him. Now, he was convinced he was dealing with some unknown alpha predator that could trump bear, coyotes, or wolves. Now, he told David that he has far more respect for what the woods hold and is very selective about where he hunts, if at all anymore. Now, the following year, he had apparently told a close family friend about his experience from that fall. They too would tell Clark about their own experiences while living up in the state of Michigan and later Wisconsin back in the 1980s, and that these sightings and experiences would continue with this family friend even after moving down to Oklahoma. Now, this is when Clark learns that they were actually referred to as dogman, and his family friend's descriptions were nearly identical to what Clark saw, which was a large, black, muscular bipedal wolf with sharp features and yellow eyes. Now, it's important to note that there appears to be a plethora of dogman accounts in Oklahoma. Still, it is not exclusive to that state. In fact, many other areas, even outside the continental United States, also have horrific encounters with similar creatures. Specifically, the South and even down to Mexico. Like this story, for example. A man named Jonathan recounted a chilling tale of an apparent dogman attack in Mexico, as reported on the website Beyond Creepy. Jonathan said that the incident involved his uncle driving a cargo truck through a remote jungle area at night. Now, as they navigated the rough, unpaved road, something large and heavy reportedly leaped into the back of their truck. Now, his uncles didn't halt to investigate what it was just due to the absence of any light on the road, but the uncle on the passenger side spotted a devilish creature resembling a dog advancing towards the truck's cabin. They described the creature as enormous. Fear then gripped them, and they screamed as they saw it, attempting to shake the truck in hopes of dislodging this thing. However, it did not fall off until they collided with the tree on the opposite side of the road. They still continued driving, their nerves frayed from night until morning. And upon reaching a gas station in a village, they discovered gash marks and animal-like handprints on the windows where the creature had tried to gain entry and on the back trailer. So they relayed their story to some villagers and farmers, who informed them that this dogman-like demon creature were known to roam those particular areas. They were also told that they were not the only ones who had been attacked, and that the fear was so intense that even as they told their experience, the hair on their arms stood on end. They vowed to never drive through Central America at night unless they were within the confines of any city or village. Now, Jonathan wished he had recounted their accounts because his uncles have since passed away, but they maintained the veracity of their story until their last dying breath, and Jonathan confirmed they were not drug users. What's really interesting to me about that particular story is that these aren't just some creepypastas you find online. That particular story is in an area where it's just so rural, and these people are just farmers trying to just survive, and to them, that's normal, right? They have other accounts of these kinds of things happening in and around their country. So to them, it's just something else they have to deal with. Another Latino man, Tony Martinez, had ran a small taco truck on the outskirts of a small Spanish town, set up in what used to be an old parking lot. Lately, he had been pouring a significant portion of his profits into repairs due to these large dents and scratches mysteriously appearing on his truck overnight. His operations would shut down in the evening, with his two-man crew cleaning up and heading home by around 8:30. Now, for a while, Tony had no surveillance equipment and began noticing deep scratch marks on his truck. Now, this didn't happen every night, but it was often enough to cause concern. Other times, they would arrive in the morning to find huge dents on the side. Now, the location of Tony's taco truck was somewhat isolated on the edge of a larger village, with not much else in the area. However, they managed to attract decent foot traffic, and beyond them was an undeveloped plot of land with wilderness beyond. And so Tony initially thought they were attracting critters because his employees weren't properly disposing of daily waste and food products. However, once he installed a surveillance system, he would quickly discover that this was not the case. What Tony claims he saw on the surveillance footage both scared and baffled him. He would see a canine figure approach the truck and attack it. Now, this creature would walk around the truck and sporadically attack the side of it, clawing and biting. In fact, there were moments when the creature would charge the truck from off camera and slam into it. And Tony even remembered watching the footage for the first time thinking, "What is this?" He even had some of his employees watch it to confirm that he wasn't crazy, and they were seeing the same thing. Now, Tony didn't know what this thing was or why it was attacking his truck, but it was costing him a lot of money. He ended up having to move his truck far away from that location. He couldn't stress enough that this thing was large, and he claimed it walked on two legs. He didn't know of any animal that did this, but this one did. Now, since moving to the new location, he has not apparently had any issues, but he kept a 12-gauge shotgun ready in case this thing decided to attack his truck. Now, afterward, he gave the footage to authorities to help him identify the culprit of the attack, but was strictly advised not to show the footage to anyone, and the footage was then confiscated. As of 2019, he left the business shortly after these events. What truly attacked his vehicle is a mystery. But folks, it gets even worse if you live in the South. A man named Roger lived near the Arkansas River and had several encounters with what he believed to be the dogman. For those that are unfamiliar, this large black dog could be deadly if one wasn't careful. Roger had to keep his animals in at night for fear of being mauled. Now, he used to have 4 dogs, but one was slaughtered by this creature, supposedly. The dog was a bloodhound, a pet he loved dearly. He had named him Brave, having raised him from a puppy. Now, one evening, as Roger was returning home from work, he just saw Brave lying in his back field, beaten and bloody. Now, when he ran over to him, the dog was covered in blood from head to toe, with deep 6-inch lacerations all over its body. And they were in patterns of 4 and 5, as if he had been clawed violently by some large animal. It looked like one of the lacerations had nicked an artery in Brave's neck because he was bleeding out and was almost gone. His left eye was also missing, and he looked swollen with broken bones. Roger, of course, began sobbing uncontrollably, clueless about what could have done this to his beloved dog. His first thought was bear, but he hadn't seen a bear around there and wasn't aware of bears behaving in such a violent manner. Now, it wasn't long after that Roger found other mutilated animals around and near his property. Deer were pretty common to find ripped up, but sometimes he would find raccoons, possums, and even skunks, as he described, all shredded into ribbons. He had no idea what was out there killing these small animals and leaving them, but it seemed like these animals were being killed for the sake of being killed. Just recently, Roger had started hearing about a lot of screaming out by the river at around 9 in the evening. Now, it didn't sound like a human being, but rather like an animal. Like something was guttural. Now, he was too cautious and scared to risk going out to see what it was, but the way his property was situated, if you exited through the back screen door and walked out a little ways, say about 100 to 200 yards, the land would start to go downhill towards a creek. Now, this screaming sounded like it was coming down by the creek. Whatever was making it had to have been very large and very loud. Now, instinctively, Roger wanted to say it was a mountain lion because that was the only rational, scientific explanation that came to his mind, but it didn't quite sound like a mountain lion. It was different. Roger wouldn't even dare step foot further than he needed to on his property without carrying a high-caliber rifle for his life. He had seen this thing a few times after and trusted it less than he trusted lawyers, to quote him. This thing had been terrorizing him for long enough, and he wouldn't hesitate to put a bullet into this thing. For those who had dealt with similar experiences, Roger was sure they would agree that this thing was easier to hear than it was to see. Now, he had only ever seen it a handful of times, but he had heard it way more often than he would have liked. It was almost as if it wanted him to know it was in the area, but didn't want him to see it. This next account was from a man named Bob when he was only 12 years old, and the incident I'm about to tell you occurred. He remembers it very vividly. He had woken up in the middle of the night to quench his thirst and had done so. Then he thought he needed to use the bathroom. Afterward, he crawled back into bed but couldn't quite get comfortable, and you know how it is when you're tired and you're trying to toss and turn. Now, suddenly, the motion light detector outside his window turns on. Now, his bedroom was near the front door, so whenever the motion light detector was triggered, he could see if somebody was standing outside their door from his position in bed. The light was bright enough that even though with his eyes closed, he noticed a change in the lighting. And just out of reflex, he opens his eyes and he looked. Pressing its face against the glass was the ugliest dog face he had ever seen. Now, after a second or two of staring in horror at this animal, it dragged its face left to right, smearing saliva and mucus against the glass while never breaking eye contact with him. It had huge pointed ears and a snout reminding him of a German Shepherd. However, it was much uglier than a German Shepherd. Bob remembered his aunt's German Shepherd, which he loved dearly. Now, as the creature dragged its face against the glass, Bob was screaming, being a 12-year-old, and unsure what to do. He could tell it was almost getting off to his terror. It began to smirk at him, and he had never been stared at so intently by anyone or anything before. It was wicked, as he described, and the next thing he knew, he was running out of his bedroom in a state of sheer panic, so enveloped in fear that he didn't even remember jumping out of the bed. He only ever saw that thing once, and it wasn't like they lived anywhere unusual or rural. They resided in a typical little suburban neighborhood. Now, Bob didn't think that there were any forest or woods where they lived. In fact, his father was a pastor, and after hearing about what he saw, he pleaded for the blood of Jesus, and he prayed over him and the house. Now, Bob didn't know if it did anything, but like he said, he never saw this thing after that incident. After he ran out of his room and into his parents' room, telling them what happened, they never checked outside his bedroom. He didn't know if it was because they believed him or what, but they did not dismiss what he saw, only comforted him in his fearful state. Good job, Mom and Dad. Bob was grateful to have such understanding and believing parents, and he knew most people would immediately write off their child and tell them to return to bed, and it probably helped that he was only 12 years old versus being a little kid, as being 12 years old and telling your parents you saw this versus being like 4 or 5 probably gave him a little more substance. In another tale, Jeffrey wanted to reach out because he was curious if somebody out there could hear this and identify the creature that was stalking his trailer at night. Now, based on his consumption of related content and some Reddit and internet research, he would suspect that he might have a dogman in his vicinity. But he wanted to make sure it was clear that those who were looking for this thing, that they should not do so, because if it found them, well, he would consider them unlucky. Now, he never asked for this to happen and wished he had never had any of these encounters. Jeffrey was often awake late into the night. He suffered from chronic pain in his wrists and ankles and was generally a night owl. He lived alone in a small, single-wide trailer. Now, the area in which he resided was fairly open, with patches of woods here and there and canals not too far away. His experience with the creature were varied. Before he saw it, he would just hear it banging on his trailer and making noise. Sometimes would sound like it was charging into his trailer, banging as loudly as possible, and would oftentimes leave noticeable dents on the siding of his house as well as claw marks. However, they weren't deep, as if the creature wasn't trying to break in, but only leave marks. That's at least how Jeffrey interpreted them. Now, he remembered one particular night when he was doing dishes and looked out his kitchen window to see this thing climbing out of the brush, heading right towards his trailer. It was as if he was watching a horror movie unfold before his eyes. His jaw dropped, his eyes widened in horror, and he remembers slamming the plate he was washing down, breaking it. He runs to lock all the doors, all the windows, turns off his lights, and he hears this thing pacing slowly around his trailer for the next 45 or so minutes. It never made a noise, but you could hear it slowly walking around, and then it would go silent for a while and then continue its pacing. After maybe another hour in total, it would stop altogether, and he did not gather the courage to get up and look out the window for about another few hours to even see if it was gone. He was just confined in complete terror for those few hours. And the whole time he sat there unsure of what to do about it. Should he call the police? Would they even be able to help him, or would they blow him off entirely? Now, this particular incident happened to him around 4 p.m. in the evening, so it was broad daylight. This thing seemed to be much more active at night, and part of him wondered if it was because it couldn't be seen. He kept blinds and curtains all over his windows, not wanting to even risk seeing this thing looking in, and he often worried that this creature was looking for a weak spot to break into his home to get to him. But you think if that was the case, couldn't it just break into the window or break down the door? It's hard to say. The encounters continued for about another year until Jeffrey finally moved out of state for a different job. And because you guys made it this far into the video, I want you to all comment down below that this video is hairy, so I know who made it to the end. And if you guys enjoy this kind of content, be sure to go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button for more videos just like this one. As always, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next video.